Realm presents Born to the Blade, Episode 10.
Chapter 1. Ojo. Pain. His thoughts lurched back to it again and again, a volcanic force that would not let him think of anything else. The world swam every time he opened his eyes, red-hazed and indistinct. It was so much easier to just close them and let the pain claim his undivided attention. But every time he did that, he felt himself slipping, red giving way to black. And so he clawed his way back up again and again, fighting against the current that wanted to drag him down forever. In those moments, fragments came through. Adechike, on his knees, reaching out in horror, and some delirious part of Ojo's mind wanted to tell him that he was ruining his clothing. Blood soaking up to stain the fabric forever. Even the embassy's laundry workers, accustomed to dealing with bloodstains, would have trouble with that. And then an eruption of white-hot agony from his right arm, while Adechike whispered, "God, Ojo, stay with me. We have to stop the bleeding." No, it wasn't Adechike. It was someone else, a woman he recognized, but her name wouldn't come to him. He wasn't on the ground, lying in a pool of blood. He was in bed, and he just had the most terrible nightmare. He wanted to tell her about it, but she was tipping a cup of something thin and bitter down his throat, so he couldn't talk. When he coughed up half the liquid, she just tried again. "You have to save his arm." That wasn't her. Someone else. Takeshi? Ojo couldn't see. His eyelids were too heavy, like culottes stripped of air stone. "I have to save his life. Everything else comes after that." Penelope, that was her name. Ojo's sister Uoma laid a cool cloth on his brow, and he smiled up at her. What was she doing here? Or was he home in Kulo at last? Takeshi held him down when he tried to get up. Normally he could pin Takeshi with one hand tied behind his back, but he was weak, so weak. Like all the life had drained out of him. The darkness was beckoning again, and he couldn't resist it any longer. But at least the pain didn't follow him down. When he opened his eyes again, the world still swam in his vision, but he could think. The pain had faded to a medley of dull and distant aches. Only one stood out, his right arm. But when he tried to lift it and see, Takeshi was there, stopping him with a gentle hand and an expression that said he'd done this more than once already. A bitter taste lingered on Ojo's tongue. Laudanum. He struggled to speak. "I'm alive." Takeshi let go and brought him a cup of water. Even swallowing that was almost too much. The laudanum made it difficult to breathe, like a ram wool was sitting on his chest. He had to pause for air between sips. Finally, Takeshi set the cup aside and said in a rough, strained voice, "What happened?" Someone had taken the memories and tossed them around like confetti. But they were still there, veiled attackers, too many of them for Ojo to hold off, even with two blades. He'd sold himself as dear as he could, but in the end... Telling that took even longer than drinking the water had, for the same reasons, and more besides. "Who were they?" Takeshi asked when he was done. Ojo shook his head and immediately regretted it. Even that small amount of movement sent a rush of pain down his arm and made the room waltz around him. "I didn't see faces. But there must have been something. Their fighting style, maybe, or their clothing. Assassins wouldn't be foolish enough to wear identifying marks. And it was one thing to analyze style while facing someone in the dueling arena, quite another to do it while defending against what seemed like a dozen blades at once. But there was something. Their voices," Ojo said. Takeshi sat up sharply. "You recognize them?" He remembered in time not to shake his head. Not directly, but when they called out to each other, their accents..." The rest caught in his throat. Even hazed with laudanum, he knew these words would start him down a path he couldn't come back from. No, not start. He'd said it already in his delirium. Takeshi must not have heard him. Had anyone else? You can't hold it back. Not this. Not now. Ojo whispered. They sounded Rumikan. Takeshi's expression settled like stone. He might not be the best in a duel, but he was no political innocent, unable to read the implications of that for himself. Ojo couldn't face those implications. Not right now. Where's Penelope? A muffled sound burst from Takeshi. You're not saying she was what? One glacial step at a time, Ojo pieced it together. No, gods, no, I thought. She helped treat me, made me drink the laudanum. The other warder sagged back in his chair. No, that was Maduenu, your physician. Penelope is still on Vania. His words snuffed the tiny flame of hope that had burned inside Ojo. Of course, Penelope was on Vania where she was needed. Needed by people other than him. He knew that. In a dust-dry whisper, he requested more water. I should let you sleep, Takeshi said afterward. Were you there? Ojo asked. Was I where? Here, he said none too clearly. I thought I remembered you when I was... They both knew what had nearly happened. Ojo made himself say it. Dying. Takeshi's expression was haunted. I tied off your right arm with a tourniquet to keep you from bleeding out. I did what I could until Maduenu got here, but it... He stood abruptly, bowing low. Please forgive me. I should have done more. Ojo's throat closed up. He'd been trying to ignore it this whole time, but now he made himself lift his head and look down at his own body, swathed in bandages. His arm was still there. You'll keep it, Takeshi hurried to say, realizing what Ojo had thought. Maduenu says so, anyway, though she wasn't optimistic at first. But it's damaged. A bad cut to your forearm. The muscles and tendons may not recover. His face crumpled again. I'm so sorry. It wasn't his fault. Ojo tried to say so, but the words wouldn't come. After an agonizing moment, Takeshi said, I should tell Maduenu that she woke up. He was almost at the door when Ojo found his voice again. Where is Dechike? Takeshi didn't turn to face him. Gone. Once he knew you would live, he left. Dechike wouldn't do that, wouldn't abandon Ojo, not unless duty required it somehow. Or he'd heard something he shouldn't. The dead, heavy feeling came back. Where did he go? Takeshi's answer was nearly too soft to hear. After the assassins. And Chris. Chapter 2. Michiko. The shrine was empty, but Michiko knew that was, in a sense, an illusion. It was the home of the ancestors, not just her own, but all of Kakute's. Any true-born child of the island could kneel here, call upon their forebears, and be answered. She had spent months dreading this place, avoiding it whenever possible, fearing what the Golden Lord would say to her, and how her other ancestors would respond. Now her hands were steady as she removed the lid from her lacquered box. The candles needed refreshing. She set new ones in place of the old, then straightened the little stand that held her family banner. It was toy-sized compared to the great banners carried onto the battlefield and hung unmoving in the still air of the shrine. But thanks to the Golden Lord's memories, she knew what the great ones had looked like during the war against Murtika. She took a stick of knuckle from her box, lit the incense, and set it before the banner. Then she draped her prayer beads over her hands, set her palms against each other, and recited the incantation of remembrance. They came to her, all her ancestors, Aiko, Hiroaki, Takao, Megumi, Reiko, stretching to the fringes of those who could be called. Beyond 2 generations, it was usually impossible to make contact. She wished she could have spoken with more of those before her grandfather, those who had known Kakute as it was before Murtika came. Perhaps they sensed something in her mood because they did not immediately bombard her with questions or commands. Instead, they waited, until at last the Golden Lord said, "What is it, child?" Michiko's posture was flawless, her hands as steady as the sun. She said, "It was Murtika. They destroyed the fleet. They began this war." Whispers and ghostly shudders. She could feel the Golden Lord's pleasure and wrath, pleasure that his suspicions had been proved, and wrath against his hated conquerors. The rest of her ancestors, those loyal to Murtika, were less sure how to respond. Finally, Hiroaki ventured a cautious reply. "Kulo is a great threat, after all. They once cut Zenitai from the sky hundreds of years ago," Michiko snapped. "And now they are sinking. Should the whole island be condemned for the crimes of their ancestors? And what of Rumika? What have they done to earn this kind of conflict, other than be successful? Murtika should admire their achievement, but the Empire is riddled with hypocrisy, approving only of excellence when it benefits them. I discovered what they have done. Who wants to wager that they'll applaud me for it?" Silence from most of her ancestors. From the Golden Lord, a rich laugh. "And you," Michiko said, turning the force of her attention on him. "You may have ruled Kakute once, but you are also the man who lost, who surrendered to Murtika because you weren't strong enough to beat them. I will accept your advice as I find merit in it, but do not think that I am about to bend my neck to your every demand. I know Murtika better than you do because I have learned their ways." She expected fury, and for an instant there was a flicker of it, because even decades in prison had not acclimated Genji no Nobu to being commanded. But when he spoke, his tone was quiet, even proud. "You have found your steel, at last." Aiko's quavering voice cut in. "But what are you going to do?" Michiko's hands tensed within their cage of beads. "I am going to tell the truth." Chapter 3. Chris. The warder's circle wasn't just empty. It was deserted. Chris felt the absences. Kensuke retired to Kakute. Penelope returned home for the sake of her child's birthright. Taro so removed from the affairs of the circle that he might as well not be on Tuafe. Lavinia gone to war, and good riddance to her, except that she would be lethal wherever she went, and now she wasn't anywhere Chris could keep an eye on her. Ojo. Rumors said he was dead. Rumors said he had lost his arm. Rumors said 1,000 things, none of them good, and half of them blaming Rumika. The warder's circle was supposed to prevent this kind of thing. It gave the nations a way to settle their disputes without warfare, with the limited and ritualized violence of a duel. But that only worked if people believed in it. It was a game, and everyone had agreed to play by its rules, until they didn't. Sure, there were still warders on Tuafe, juniors thrust into the role of seniors, unwilling and unprepared, and worst of all, unsupported. Their nations had abandoned them to play out what remained of this farce, while behind that disintegrating cover of civility, they prepared for and carried out war. What was Adechike here for except to spy? What was Bologna apart from the Empress's mouthpiece? What could Cassia do when her shrine wouldn't even grant her the permanent title of senior warder? What could Chris do? They approached the table, one dragging step after another. The ritual swords lay in their grooves, radiating outward like a star. 7 swords. Less than a year ago, it had been 6. Maybe it should have stayed that way. Chris's hand hovered just above the hilt of the Rumikan sword. If they had never come to Tuafe... Before there had been balance. 6 warders, often deadlocked, but even stagnation was better than what the sky had now. 7 was unstable. That had been the proudest day of Chris's life. Winning the gauntlet, joining the circle, and seeing the tablet expand. Striking the trade deal with Ojo. But everything they'd done had just made things worse. I should never have come, Chris whispered. The words drifted through the silent, deserted chamber like a wind ghost. Rumika was better off before it had a warder. Or the elders should have sent someone else, someone who wouldn't have made Chris's mistakes. Their fingertips brushed the hilt of the sword, then wrapped around it. The blade was light as a feather in their strong grip, and yet it felt infinitely heavy. The Tsukiseni had a sigil for moments like these. Chris had thought it pointless when they read about it. Who would ever want to use such a thing? But now they understood. When you had failed this badly, when your deeds rendered everything the blade in your hand stood for into pitiful mockery, then perhaps the only right thing to do was to break it. Chris's grip tightened. The sigil was simple, just 2 crossing slashes, a grand circle above the head, and then a strike directly downward, driving the point to the floor. The work of a few seconds, and it would be done. They couldn't do it. Biting their lips so hard it ached, Chris returned the blade to the table. Maybe someone else would pick it up someday and use it for good. Then they turned and left the chamber, adding one more absence to the rest. Chapter 4. Cassia. Cassia hated sick rooms. Penelope always insisted that a proper battle mistress should visit her soldiers when they were wounded, but that was just the 79th reason why Cassia would never be a proper battle mistress. It was one thing to inflict a wound in the heat of battle. Afterward, when the rush of the fight had faded, the thought of it nauseated her. Flesh gaping open or held together by silken stitches, the telltale foulness of an infected wound, and people lying helpless, so that she was never quite sure where to look or what to say. But she represented Vanya for now, and if there was one point on which she could live up to her people's ideals, it was facing her duty. All the embassies had guards, but in the Kuloi complex they were usually just a token presence. Now the place made the Murtikan embassy look undefended. They'd failed their warder once by nearly letting him get killed. They weren't going to let that happen again. Cassia approached slowly, keeping her hands in sight, and announced herself to the pair who detached themselves from the gate. One took the message inside while the other kept watch over her, and 2 more continued to guard the entrance. Step by cautious step, she was transferred through the layers of defense. The last doorkeeper was a woman Cassia had never seen before, who introduced herself as Maduenu Nagaguka, the embassy physician. "If this is merely a sympathy call," Nagaguka said, "I will tell him you came. He isn't strong enough to receive many visitors right now, and we need to save his energy for necessary matters." Would she have come in the middle of the night just to offer sympathy? Cassia held back the urge to snap that at the physician. "It's necessary. I'm the warder pro tem for Vanya, and the Trine has tasked me with conveying a message to Warder Kante. I will keep it as brief as I can, but unless Kulo has appointed a Dejike as interim warder while Warder Kante recovers, I need to speak with him as soon as possible." Nagakuka might be a monarch in defense of her patient, but she wouldn't stand in the way of official business. "Let me see if he's awake." He wasn't, but Cassia said she was willing to wait. Not long after that, Nagakuka returned and beckoned for her to follow. It was even worse than she expected. His skin looked dull and thin, as if he had aged 20 years in the blink of an eye. His left hand was wrapped in bandages, as was his entire right arm. The sheet over him did not lie smooth, but rippled where other injuries had been bound tight. His eyes were the worst, though. They gazed half through her, as if he couldn't muster the will to even focus. That might have been the laudanum, but it felt like more. Like Ojo Kante had given up. "Cassia," he said, then, Warder Petros, Warder Pro Tem. "I'm sorry. Maduenu said you had a message from the Trine." Even if the physician hadn't reminded her to be quick, Cassia would have cut directly to the point, just to give him some shred of hope. She said, "On behalf of the Trine of Vanya, I have come to tell you that our battle mistresses and our fleets will join you in your struggle against Rumika and Murtika." He blinked. And again, and said nothing. Maybe the formal language wasn't getting through the laudanum. Cassia said, "We're allying ourselves with you." His lips trembled. How? Why? The Trine had given her a formal statement which she would deliver in the circle tomorrow. It was important to watch the phrasing of such things, to make sure they said only as much as the government wanted, in the way they wanted. Who knew how many clerks had sweated over writing it, handcrafting every phrase about Mertican aggression and Kulal being the first and worst victim of the loss of the fleet? Cassia reached into her sleeve for the document and stopped. She couldn't think of him as Warder Conte, not when he was like this. He'd always been the kindest and most generous of the warders, the one most dedicated to camaraderie within the circle. Now it was all falling apart. War across the entire sky, half the senior warders gone, the remainder at each other's throats. And she'd heard the rumors before she ever arrived at the embassy. It wasn't true that he'd lost his arm, but would he ever fight again? Her hand curled into a fist. Then she removed it from her sleeve and said, "Penelope." Life sparked in his eyes. "The Trine has been sitting on a fence for a generation, and more, arguing over whether they should beat down Mertika while they still can, or stay out of it for Vania's own safety." "Battle mistresses," Cassia snorted, letting her disgust show. "They like to talk as if they could conquer the whole sky if they weren't too noble to do it, but half of them are cowards at heart. They're afraid of Mertika, and with good reason. But not Penelope. She stood there in the council chamber, big as a ramwell, and told the Trine that if they aren't willing to support Kulal and stand up to Mertika, their honor isn't worth a piss in the maelstrom. And she convinced them. Now she did take out the document and held it up for him to see. "I have the proof right here." Ojo trembled. His mouth worked silently for a moment before anything would come out. When he finally spoke, it was just 2 words. "Thank you." Cassia saluted him formally. "I'll be announcing it tomorrow, but you needed to know first. And now I should go, because I think your physician might poison my tea if I keep you talking for too long. Take care of yourself. Rest well. I'll see you later." Then she fled. If there was one thing she hated more than sick rooms, it was watching people cry. Chapter 5. Michiko. Takeshi wasn't at the Ikaten embassy, and none of the staff knew where he had gone. "Please, Warder Oda, you have to find him," the chief secretary said, clutching at her sleeve in his panic. "He was supposed to be at the Mertican embassy, but he isn't there anymore. They're saying the Kuloi warder has been killed. If Warder Ueda is dead too—" No, he can't be. Please, will you search for him?" Michiko recoiled, her skin crawling in horror. "Oh, Joe is dead? That's what they're saying. Assassins in the night, here, on Toifei. I knew it was a mistake to let those refugees come here." The rest of his words faded behind her as she set off at a run for the Kuloi embassy. Soon her steps slowed, though, as the import of the secretary's words sank in. Granted, rumor tended to exaggerate, but even so. If the chaos on Toifei had gotten that bad, then she couldn't afford to race blindly ahead, not even here on the upper island where she ought to be safe. And the guards of the embassy certainly would not thank an armed woman for running toward their gate when they were on high alert. Besides, what about Takeshi? She stopped and cast a glance over her shoulder, considering the layout of the upper island. The secretary had said he wasn't at the Mertican embassy anymore. Would he be with the Rumicans? She knew he'd been practicing with Chris, the 2 of them growing oddly close. Or maybe at the Kuloi embassy, trying to find out if the rumors held any truth? Or not on the upper island at all. Maybe he went to the tea house looking for information. Too many possibilities. But whatever was happening with Ojo, she couldn't do anything about it. He needed to know the truth about the fleet, and so did Chris, but she was first and foremost the warder for Kakute, and that meant she had to attend to her own country's needs. Before her indecision could resolve itself, she heard footsteps. One hand went to the hilt of her sword, then hesitated. Had it really come to this? Drawing steel in a darkened street just because she heard someone approaching? Michiko? Her hand sprang away from the blade as if it had been burned. Takeshi, what are you doing here? Heading home? Takeshi came close enough for her to see him as more than a weary-shouldered shadow. Where have you been? Searching for you, she said. It was at least partly true. No one at your embassy knew where you'd gone. Is it true what they're saying? That Ojo's dead? Takeshi sagged against the nearest wall. No, though it was a near thing. I've been helping take care of him, but at this point there's nothing I can really do, so Maduenu sent me home. Michiko's heart thudded with relief. What happened to him? He shook his head. Don't know. I mean, he woke up and told us what he knows. He got jumped by a group of people in veils. Then he pushed off the wall and drew his blade. Michiko's was halfway out of its sheath before he gestured for her to stop. With precise, elegant movements, he drew the sigil for shrouded voices, dampening the sound around them. When that was done, Takeshi resheathed his blade. Ojo said they sounded Rumikan. Michiko spat a bitter laugh. I doubt that. Takeshi frowned at her. I know you and Chris are friends, but no, you aren't just saying that. What do you know? The cool serenity she'd felt when communing with her ancestors was gone, replaced by fire. Anton picked up a survivor from the trade fleet. She was nearly dead when he found her. Injury, starvation, dehydration. But she's recovered. And I spoke to her. Takeshi's lips shaped a soundless curse. So the survivors saw what happened? It was Martika, Michiko said. They sank the fleet. What had she expected? For that fire to leap from her into Takeshi so that he drew his blade with righteous fury and declared that justice must be done? That wasn't who he was. Instead, he swayed on his feet, putting one hand out to steady himself against the wall. The Empire. You're saying they started the war? They at least wanted to break the alliance between Kulo and Rumika. Michiko's lip curled in a snarl. The war may just be a nice side benefit. Gives them an excuse to start conquering again. But he started another half-dozen replies, and each one of them died, unborn. This isn't even conquest, it's chaos. Do you think the Empress cares? They both knew the answer to that. The glory for the war would go to Murtican generals. The cost of it would fall on everyone else. Takeshi finally said, Who have you told? Michiko was still wearing her ancestral communion robes. She smoothed the front of the crossed collar, shook out her square-cut sleeves. It felt odd to walk around in traditional Kakutan garb, but also right. She couldn't do what she must while wearing a Murtican tunic. My ancestors, and you. Whether you're loyal to the Empire or not, you deserve to know whose lead you're following. And I know I can trust you to tell the others if I don't get the chance. Takeshi was far too clever to miss the implication buried in those words. He said, Why, where are you going? To the Murtican embassy, Michiko said, dropping one hand to her sword hilt. It's time Bologna and I had a conversation. Chapter 6. Takeshi. When Michiko was gone, Takeshi slumped against the wall at his side and sat down right there in the street. In a moment, he would get up and do something. Some vague sense of colonial duty tried to tell him he should go stop the oncoming confrontation between Michiko and Bologna, but that, he decided, was between the two of them. And between Murtika and Rumika and Kulo. His thoughts gave up. It was too large to deal with right now. Everything had gotten too large. He stared at his hands. He'd washed them thoroughly at the Kuloi embassy. Ojo's blood was long gone. But Takeshi could still see it, and the mangled wreck of the warder's body with the Dechike frantically trying to stop the bleeding. You have to save his arm. I have to save his life. Everything else comes after that. Maduenu was right. With that much blood loss, Ojo was lucky to be alive. And if he had any use of his hand after that, it was more than just luck. Like all blade crafters, Takeshi had studied anatomy because you had to know how bodies worked in order to do the most damage to your opponents. He knew which muscles in the forearm controlled the fingers, and he knew that Ojo's had been completely severed. He'd seen the bone gleaming white through the gash. But when Maduenu stitched Ojo up, the muscles were still connected, damaged, but there. No one had ever been able to invent a healing sigil, though countless bladecrafters had tried. Takeshi had read all manner of theories as to why. In the end, the only things that could mend the body were herbs, the surgeon's needle, and the Zenaten birthright. It was impossible. Kulo had cut Zenatai from the sky 200 years before. No one had been born on the island since then because there was no island to be born on. The Zenatans on Tuafe defined themselves by ancestry and choice, not any link to the soil of their ancient home. Even if Takeshi's mother had lied about where she gave birth, he couldn't possibly possess that gift. The ability to heal? Takeshi beat his head gently against the wall behind him. Absurd. He was imagining things. Ojo had been injured, yes, but not as badly as they'd feared. He didn't bleed out before Maduenu got to him because he was a tough old bastard and not that easy to get rid of. Takeshi had overestimated the damage to his arm. All of that was a far simpler and more plausible explanation for what had happened than Takeshi secretly having the lost Zenaten birthright. But he wanted it to be true. Because then at least he would have a birthright. He would be an imposter still, but one keeping a secret about what he had rather than what he lacked. He remembered Ojo's blood pulsing weakly through his fingers as Adechike begged him to do something, anything. He remembered focusing. Like he had focused after Chris had wounded him in the gauntlet. Like he had focused when treating a half-dead Rumican sailor suffering from cuts and starvation and dehydration. Like he had focused on other occasions, thinking only that he was concentrating and he was good at patching people up because he studied so hard. Takeshi's hands began to shake. Shrouded Voices was still in effect, though it would fade soon. Takeshi braced his elbows on his knees and addressed the empty street, knowing no one could hear him. All right, think this through. Your theory is that you have the Zenaten birthright. How? Unknown and irrelevant if it turns out that you're wrong. The street listened, patiently. The next step was obvious, but Takeshi still had to force himself to say it. Therefore, you should find out whether you can heal. Small injuries, things where he could clearly see the extent of the damage and measure how much he'd affected it. Maybe at the clinic on the lower island? No, that might attract too much attention if it worked and someone noticed. He was better off experimenting on himself, or maybe Chris, if they were willing. Not tonight. Maybe not even tomorrow. Murtika had destroyed the trade fleet and someone had tried to assassinate Ojo. This was not the time to be conducting trials with flesh and blood. But he had a feeling the war would give him plenty of opportunities soon enough. Chapter 7. Michiko. The Murtican embassy was like a kicked anthill, staff swarming everywhere and the guard out in force. Michiko wondered cynically how many of those people were doing anything useful, and how many Bologna had sent off on errands just so she could be seen giving orders and taking action. Or maybe they were all keeping busy to avoid Bologna's eye. None of them tried to stop her progress through the halls, though she got more than a few curious glances for her Kakutan robes. After all, wasn't she Murtican? A poor colonial copy, of course, striving toward an ideal she could never reach, but still just another cog in the imperial machine. Whatever task had her striding with purpose toward Lavinia's office, Bologna's office now, surely it was dedicated to the greater glory of the Empire. The office was deserted. But past the disgusting waste of the floating airstone screen, the door to the garden was open, letting the cool pre-dawn air through. Bologna was outside, standing in front of one of the meticulously groomed rosebeds, fingering a half-open blossom. Her chin tucked low, she seemed to be deep in thought, and unaware of Michiko's presence. She was armed, as all of them were always armed, and so Michiko deliberately slammed the garden door behind herself as she went outside. Bologna shot upright with a jerk and reached for her sword, but Michiko was still far enough away that she didn't register as an attacker, and so Bologna relaxed. Oh, it's you. Where in the sky have you been? Of all the times to vanish. Bad enough if you only miss my dinner party, but it's gone far beyond that. I have a dozen things you ought to be doing, and I've had to do them myself. When Michiko first arrived on Toifei, those words would have hurt. Back then, she had wanted nothing more than to prove her use. Now, she only laughed. Poor Bologna, having to actually do the work herself. Lavinia might as well still be here giving you orders. It shouldn't have been possible for Bologna to stiffen more. What did you just say? I mean that you're her lackey, Michiko said contemptuously. You always have been. You're a paragon of Mertican excellence, Bologna, a most excellent dog, leaping at your mistress's command. Bologna left the rosebed behind and stalked toward her, heels stabbing into the grass with each step. Are you drunk, or have you just lost your mind? Found it, I should say, and did a great many other things besides. Like a survivor from the trade fleet, someone who saw the Mertican fleet descend and cut the cargo ships from the sky. That stopped Bologna mid-stride, staggering. Michiko smiled coldly at her. Did you carry those orders for Lavinia? Did you help send out the ships to St. Culo, to push them to such a desperate point that they do anything to survive? Because Mertika is frightened of Rumika and their rise, frightened of Culo's strength, frightened of anything that might threaten their assumption of supremacy. You Imperials like to pretend you're so admirable, but you'll resort to the dirtiest tricks available just to maintain your own power. Did you send the assassins, Bologna? Did you set the attack up to frame Rumika? Are you the reason Ojo nearly died tonight? Was the shock real? Before Michiko could decide, Bologna regained her composure like a steel mask slamming down. So, now you stoop to spreading rumors and wild speculation. A survivor of the fleet. How convenient. They must be utterly trustworthy, this person. There's no chance anyone could have paid them to slander the Empire. And Ojo? She sneered. If I wanted him dead, I'd face him in a duel. You could never beat Ojo, Michiko snapped. You aren't Lavinia, Bologna, no matter how much you try to live down to her example. Bologna's laugh held a wild edge. Live down? Oh, little Michiko. That's almost funny, coming from a pathetic little colonial like you. No matter how much we try to extend opportunities to Kakute and Ikado and all the rest of our possessions, even the best of you can never truly match a Mertican. I'm done trying. She watched the words strike home. Bologna's eyes went wide, staring as if she might find some sign that this was all a terrible joke. And then a wave of disbelieving hurt, because for all her arrogant ways, Bologna had, in some twisted fashion, thought that the two of them were allies, even friends. And then, as inevitable as thunder after lightning, the fury of betrayal. You will bleed for this, Bologna snarled. Michiko drew her blade, the movement slow and deliberate. I am the daughter of Oda no Genzo, who was the son of Takeda no Achie, and of Genju no Nobu, the last golden lord of Kakute. For the honor of my ancestors, I will bend my neck no more. And they began. Bologna opened, as she so often did, with a sigil meant to enhance her speed because she was used to civilized duels where the combatants prepared themselves before launching an attack. Michiko whipped her sword through the sinuous, sweeping lines of the grass-scything cut, but she didn't aim it at the manicured lawns beneath her feet, which would yield nothing of substance. Instead, she targeted the rose bushes behind Bologna. The thorny branches tore free and swept past Bologna in a whirlwind, raking her arms and her face and tangling in her hair. Bologna shrieked, concentration broken, dropping her sigil before it was complete. In that moment, Michiko coiled her back leg and closed the distance with an explosive lunge. She hadn't wounded Bologna seriously with the rose branches, and the Mertican was too disciplined to lose focus completely. Bologna stepped into and past Michiko's lunge, levering her blade in an awkward parry that nonetheless did the job. Traitor! She spat as if it needed to be said. Turning against us in a time of war. I thought Kakutens had some notion of honor. Michiko didn't waste breath on speech. Instead, she pressed her momentum, trying to keep Bologna on her heels and off-tempo. Her own style shifted with each move, as if she was shaking off the strict geometry of the Mertican true way, reverting to the island styles from which it had evolved. Was the Golden Lord with her, somehow guiding her hand? Bologna kept up her spiraling retreat, constantly forcing changes of direction that denied Michiko an opening, and Michiko couldn't afford to back off to the range that would favor the island's stance because this was no formal duel of blade, with craft outlawed. Given a moment of breathing space, Bologna would use it to carve a sigil. Or even half a moment. What she thought was a mistake from Bologna stepping too close turned out to be a maneuver. Bologna's foot hooked Michiko's own, and although Michiko managed to keep from falling, her stagger was opening enough. An arc of flame raked along her left side, narrowly missing a direct strike. Michiko dove behind a cluster of bushes as a second and third blast seared the air. She hastily scribed impervious air around herself just in time. A moment later, the bushes detonated into splinters and smoke. But with that sigil armoring her, Michiko could afford to take a few breaths to further augment herself. She got through Gale Step and Eye of the Needle before Bologna slammed her own blade down through the fury of sky and stone, shaking the ground beneath Michiko's feet. This time, Michiko did fall, but from her prone position, she managed to carve Eagle's talon and yank Bologna's feet out from under her. They rolled upright at the same time, already breathing hard. The quick victory Michiko had hoped for was gone. Now they were in it for the duration. She made the split-second tactical decision to sacrifice any opening in favor of bolstering herself with eternal wind, and fought down the irrational urge to laugh when Bologna did the same. Movement caught her eye. Of course they couldn't wreck the garden and not attract attention, especially on the night when the Kuloi warder had nearly been assassinated. Michiko's heart sank. So much for the endurance granted by eternal wind. Once the guards involved themselves, this would be over very quickly. But Bologna whirled and carved another sigil, not aimed at Michiko. A shimmering wall of force sprang up, cutting the two of them off from the rest of the embassy, with the guards on the far side. Bologna turned back, smiling viciously. Your blood is mine. No true Mertican needs help to cut down a pathetic traitor like you. Foolish arrogance. But Michiko couldn't deny her own moment of foolishness, failing to strike while Bologna's back was turned. She whispered a quick prayer to her ancestors and closed again. On empty air. When had Bologna scribed Airstone's stance? She soared over Michiko's head, and only a quick dive roll forward saved Michiko from the flames that thundered down from above. But she came up on one knee and covered a mud pit just as Bologna returned to earth, then laughed in satisfaction to see the other woman sink to her knees in the sucking morass. Not for long. The hilt of Michiko's sword grew scorchingly hot in her hands. Hissing in pain, she tried to hold on, but her body wouldn't obey. Her palm and fingers began to blister, and the instinct of self-preservation forced her to drop the weapon. Bologna should have taken that moment to finish her. But Mertican dignity meant she focused instead on climbing out of the pit. And while she did so, Michiko snatched out her belt knife and cut a sigil with its tiny blade. She could barely feel the resonance guiding her as she shaped the form, but she'd seen knifecraft all over Toifei, on the lifts, in the dueling club, and if it wasn't as powerful as the effects one could achieve with a full-length blade, it didn't need to be. She just needed to cool her sword enough to pick it up again. What are you doing? Bologna snarled, too late. Michiko's blistered hands screamed at the contact, but she snatched up her sword and hurled herself into range, and Bologna chose the wrong direction to try circling away. They wound up body to body, too close for any proper form. Michiko threw an elbow into Bologna's face, striking one of the cuts opened by the rose's thorns, sending blood into her eye. At the same time, a burning line traced itself across her calf. Maybe not even a deliberate attack, just Bologna's sword swinging wild as she stumbled. They broke apart and came together again, technique disintegrating as they hammered each other with any weapon that came to hand, from blades and hilts to hands and feet to whatever brief sigils they could carve in the gaps. They'd trained together too much. Both of them fought clear long enough to scribe something, and in that instant they chose the same sigil. Thunderstorm Front. The two effects slammed together and detonated, knocking both of them across the ground. Michiko rolled and came to her knees, gasping. On the other side of the garden, Bologna did the same. Beyond the wall of force, the guards were preparing. The sigil's effect was a clear message, but they weren't about to let their warder die in an unsanctioned duel. As soon as it faded, they were going to come through, and Michiko couldn't keep this up for much longer. But neither could Bologna. They both remained where they were in mirrored poses, on one knee with the other foot planted to rise. They were bleeding and filthy and burned. Michiko could barely grip her blade. Whoever made the next mistake would pay dearly for it, but it was a coin toss which one of them it would be. Bologna isn't my target. She wasn't Michiko's friend either, but it wasn't worth dying here in the garden of the Mertican embassy just for the chance to take Bologna out. The real enemy was elsewhere and bigger. The Empire itself. The instant Michiko moved, Bologna surged to her feet, drawing a defensive sigil, but she miscalculated because Michiko's own sigil wasn't an attack. Airstone stance carried her up and over the garden wall into the street behind the embassy. As she came down, Michiko carved another sigil, this one to hide her from view, but it wasn't necessary. No one followed. She staggered off down the street, body aching as her augmenting effects faded. She hadn't won, but she hadn't lost either. And the war had only just begun. Chapter 8. Adechike. Tears kept blurring Adechike's vision, but he refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't help Ojo. Crying wouldn't stop the war. Nothing could. Maduenu and Takeshi had done everything in their power for Ojo, and the war was out of anyone's hands, in too many hands at once for any hope of control. The only thing Adechike could do was hunt down the people responsible and make them pay. If the assassins had been more cautious, they would have split up. But questioning one of the lift operators revealed that a group of 5 people had gone down to the lower island right after the attack, armed and out of breath. "Rumikins?" Adechike asked, his gut tight. The word had slipped out of Ojo in his delirium. The young woman tilted her hand from one side to the other. "I couldn't say. They were just Twan, and they all looked pretty clearly female or male. Didn't say anything either." That proved nothing. Rumikins could choose to shape themselves to one form or the other just as easily as something in between. He hated the way the lift forced him to stand still. Every time he stopped moving, every time he let himself think, he saw Ojo again in his mind's eye, helpless and bleeding out. Ojo, who had done more than anyone on the 3 islands to uphold the ideals of the Circle. Ojo, whom Adechike had turned his back on. Their last conversation had been a fight. If Adechike had listened to what Ojo had to say, if he'd gone home to reconcile with his uncle instead of attending Bologna's stupid dinner party. He choked down those thoughts. They wouldn't do anybody any good now. "Aye," the lift operator called as they reached the lowest island and the few passengers stepped off. "Is it true the Kuloi water, the other one, I mean, was attacked?" Adechike's fingernails cut into his palms. "Yes." She hesitated, glancing around. Then she beckoned him closer. Adechike approached warily, ready to defend himself. The young woman was Twan, not Rumikin, and armed with only a tiny knife, but he couldn't take chances anymore. "Somebody met them in the street," she said softly as a handful of people boarded the lift, "and they all headed toward the docks." Or toward the refugee camp. Was that person Rumikin? She shook her head. "No, Zanaitan, I think." His blood chilled. A descendant of the people whose island Kulo had cut from the sky. "Thank you," he said by reflex. Then he headed for the docks, not quite at a run. A thick fog was drifting through the streets, making Adechike's skin crawl. Nights like this were a time for conspiracy, for madness, for murder. The hour was late enough that it was almost early again. The various stalls and businesses that lined the streets were closed, but a thin trickle of people was beginning to flow, preparing to open them up again. Some of those people recognized Adechike, and it was clear from the whispers that word had spread. Some looked sympathetic, others, the Rumikins, didn't. He moved quickly, but not without caution. It would be the easiest thing in the world to ambush him down here in the fog. Adechike kept his hands near the hilts of his blades. Up ahead were the docks, the low, hulking shapes of warehouses and the piers beyond them, stretching like long fingers into the fog. And then he did run, even though by then it was far too late. A ship was disappearing into the fog. No sensible captain would set sail in weather like this, when the mists had risen and anything could be hiding in their depths. But there it was, a merchant ship just too solid to be mistaken for a phantom, the Twan flag flying from its stern. Adechike skidded to a halt at the edge of Tuafe, heart thumping with thwarted fury. A nearby dock worker stared at him, and Adechike whirled to grab the front of the man's jerkin. "That ship, whose is it? And were there passengers aboard?" The old man stammered, and Adechike fought the urge to shake him until his teeth rattled. Finally, he said, That's the Remembrance, Captain Wanuhe's ship. And yeah, he took on some people. Wanuhe, a Zanatan name, and a Zanatan had met the Rumikins at the lift. Adechike's fingers went nerveless and limp. The dockhand pulled himself free and ran, leaving Adechike there, staring into the fog. It was beginning to thin out, but the ship was gone, barely a shadow in the growing light of dawn. It was gone, but something else remained. Someone stood at the far end of one of the piers, an androgynous silhouette, staring out into the sky, their left hand resting on the blade at their hip. Adechike's stride lengthened and gained speed as he approached. Chris had their back to the island. Adechike was halfway down the pier before they heard his footsteps or felt them shaking the boards and turned. By then, there was nowhere to flee, except into the empty air. Chris didn't flinch at the sight of Adechike. They looked bone-tired, spine slumping uncharacteristically. When they spoke, their tone was flat, barely carrying over the sound of the wind. "What are you doing here?" "Chasing your assassins," Adechike said. Rage thickened his voice. "But it looks like you got them safely off Toifé before I could catch up." Chris shifted back a half-step, suddenly wary. "What do you mean?" Adechike's shoulders ached with tension. "That ship, the one you're watching sail away. You're gonna stand there and pretend you had nothing to do with it." I didn't. What ship? I mean, I saw it leave, but it was Rumikin's, Chris. Ojo said so himself. And you've been down in that refugee camp talking to people? I bet it wasn't even hard. Just tell him it's all Ojo's fault, even though he tried harder than anyone to stop this." Chris's body jerked at the accusation, and in turn they lashed out. "Oh, he's so innocent, is he? Tell me this. How did the Kuloi ships know to go after the refinery?" Adechike flinched, and Chris saw it. Their jaw clenched tight in a snarl. "Or maybe it was all you. Such a nice guy. Everybody likes Adechike. Is that why Kulo sent you here? Because they knew it would be easy for you to get close to me? This whole time you pretended to be my friend, but your real goal was to get me to spill Rumika's secrets so you could sell them onward. Did you do that on Ojo's orders, or was all of that your idea? How much of this did you plan from the start?" Even with all the fury and pain boiling inside him, Adechike almost apologized. He hadn't meant to betray Chris like that, truly. He just wasn't used to Toifé, where information was the most priceless currency on the 3 islands. He wasn't used to keeping secrets. But everyone else felt fine keeping secrets from him. Even Ojo had done it, hiding the truth of how badly Kulo was sinking. Chris shook their head in disgust. "You know what? I don't even care anymore. I'm done with this." They strode forward, but Adechike sidestepped to block them. Chris glared at him. "Out of my way." Adechike stood his ground. "I'm not going to let you get away like this." "Damn it, Adechike!" He didn't even make a decision. His sword was just in his hand, as if of its own accord, its point trained on Chris's heart. The wind gusted around them both, rising with the sun, tearing the fog into shreds. This was a stupid place to duel, out in public, on a narrow pier where one wrong move could send someone to the mists. But Adechike didn't care anymore. Bleakness settled into Chris's eyes. "Fine," they said. "I guess this is how it ends." They drew their blade, saluted Adechike, and attacked. Chapter 9. Chris. It was just blades at first, lunging and parrying in a fairly strict line. Out here on the narrow confines of the pier, where any sigil that damaged their support might well kill them both, caution was the only sensible choice. But Chris had left sense behind a long time ago. They were past caring about consequences, when every strike felt like a cut to their own heart. A swift retreat bought them enough space to draw the Stonefoot sign. It would limit their mobility, but that was preferable to losing their balance and falling until they vanished into the mists. Out of lunging range, Adechike did the same. Chris was faster. A downward blast of wind made Adechike bend, but he finished his defensive sigil and then cut 3 swift lines that set off a flash of blinding light in Chris's eyes. They flinched back and heard the heavy, sliding steps of Adechike's approach. Blinking madly to clear their vision, Chris blocked the first strike more on instinct than knowledge, following it up with a full-body rush that kept them at too close a measure for Adechike to use his blade. But it was a mistake to come within wrestling range of a Kuloi blade crafter. Only the stonefoot effect kept Chris from falling when Adechike tried to throw them, and their sword arm still ended up in a lock. As if locking Chris's arm was enough to stop them, they scribed a tiny sigil with nothing more than a few shifts of their wrist, and Adechike's body jerked as all the air was torn from his lungs. It should have made him let go. Anyone sensible would have dropped the joint lock and carved freedom of air, the counter to absent wind. But apparently Adechike had left sense behind, too. Only a vicious stomp to Adechike's instep broke Chris free in time to dodge the incoming blow. By then, they could see well enough to defend, and they retreated again, while Adechike regained his breath. How many times had the two of them fought under Ojo's tutoring eye? Never in anger, only in friendly competition and mutual learning. The laughter of those happier days echoed in Chris's memory. Before the gauntlet, before the trade fleet, before everything went wrong. And Ojo, he was everywhere in Adechike's movements, coloring the way the young man moved, the angles from which he tried to trap Chris's blade and lever it against them. Ojo had beaten Chris in the gauntlet, but Adechike wasn't Ojo, especially not now, with anger undermining his tactics, driving him to the brutal move rather than the effective one. Adechike wasn't Lavinia either, to meld those two into a single lethal whole. All it would take was a gamble. Chris didn't even hesitate. When Adechike retreated out of range for an instant to reset his feet, Chris made a swift, unobtrusive cut, canceling their own stonefoot sign. And then they leaped. A huge, ground-eating lunge straight at Adechike, who parried, but to the inside, letting Chris pass to the outside, ducking under their own warding arm and pivoting to face the direction they'd come from. Of course Adechike spun to defend himself, but he was still stone-footed and slow, and there was a heartbeat where Chris could have sunk their blade into his unprotected back. They didn't. Chris hesitated, and then Adechike closed the brief opening in his defense, and the fight went on. Why didn't I strike? The question buried its teeth in Chris's thoughts and refused to let go. They lured Adechike's guard wide and could have disengaged to cut at his face. They had a chance to stop thrust against a sloppy attack. Opportunity after opportunity presented itself and then vanished, untaken. Adechike didn't notice. The longer the fight went on, the deeper he drowned in his fury, his movements getting wilder and wilder. But Chris's own anger was slipping away, replaced by heart sickness. The two of them had been friends once. Did they really believe Adechike had betrayed that in cold blood? Would it make anything better if they stabbed him? No. Hurting him, killing him, would be the final mistake. Chris had come to Toifei to build a brighter future for Rumika, not through warfare and death, but through friendship and alliance. I'd rather die failing to achieve that than live and cast it aside. And that meant there was only one thing to do. Adechike pressed them harder and harder, craft abandoned in favor of the blade alone. But Chris used one of Adechike's own tricks against him, stepping close and then evading with a twist of the hip that let them slip past to the other side. And in that brief opening, they carved the sigil for the heart-piercing dart. Then they hurled their sword downward, the sigil driving it through the boards of the pier as if they were rice paper. And Chris knelt to Adechike's blade. Kneeling saved them. The first strike parted the air where their head had been a breath before, and the second didn't come. His voice so distorted it was barely recognizable, Adechike snarled, "Pick it up." "No," Chris said. Their chest heaved with exertion and passion. "I'm done. If you want me dead, Adechike, then go ahead. I won't stop you. There's no point in me fighting anymore." "You have to fight." Adechike's hand shook. You have to do what?" Chris looked up at him, slumping with weariness and sorrow. "Kill you? Hurt you the way Ojo's been hurt?" "No, all that would do is make things worse, and I'm done making things worse. I hate what happened to him, to Kulo, to the entire sky. I want..." Their throat closed up without warning. "I want to go back to being friends." It came out so quietly they weren't even sure Adechike could hear the words. but his expression trembled, the rictus of anger dissolving into something more fragile. We can't. The hilt of Chris's sword sat flush against the boards of the pier, creating the illusion that it was a weapon without a blade. Why not? We both want the same thing, safety for Kulo and for Rumika. We both want peace. And the only way we're going to find that is if we work together. Our countries are at war. Chris stretched out their hand, palm up and empty. That doesn't mean we have to be. The tip of Adechike's sword wavered. Then it dropped. His free hand came forward to grip Chris's, dragging them to their feet. Exhaustion made Chris stumble, and Adechike caught them, steadying them in an embrace. They rested their heads against each other's shoulders until their ragged breaths smoothed out. When they finally let go, Adechike glanced down. Are you going to leave that there? For one delirious instant, Chris almost said yes. It would have made a hell of a gesture, a warder walking away from their sword. But there was a crowd gathering along the edges of the island, watching their duel and its concluding truce in the morning's light. And if Chris left the blade thrust through the planks, someone would probably come take it as soon as they were gone. Besides, the sword stood for more than just death. Chris bent and drew it from the wood, then sheathed it at their hip. Come on, they said to Adechike. We've got work to do. And I want to see Ojo. You can tell the guards at the embassy not to stab me.
You're listening to Born to the Blade, Episode 10, by Marie Brennan, starring Exie Sands. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm, listen away. Born to the Blade is created by Michael R. Underwood and written by Michael R. Underwood, Marie Brennan, Cassandra Kaw, and Malka Older. It is executive produced by Julian Yap and Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.